The summer of 1987 arrived in Asheville, North Carolina, with a vengeance that nobody had predicted. Thomas Whitmore stood at the edge of his small property in the Blue Ridge Mountains, surveying the modest cabin he had been building for the past 8 months. His hands, calloused and rough from years of working with wood, held a piece of bark he had carefully harvested from a fallen chestnut oak. Thomas was 53 years old, a quiet man with silver hair and deep-set eyes that seemed to hold decades of wisdom. He had moved to Asheville after his wife Eleanor passed away from cancer 2 years prior. The cabin was supposed to be their retirement dream. Now it was his way of keeping her memory alive, building it exactly as they had planned together on those long winter nights in their old apartment in Charlotte. The local Builders Association had laughed at him. At the hardware store on Main Street, where contractors gathered every morning for coffee, Thomas had become something of a joke. His methods were old-fashioned, they said, primitive. Nobody used bark shingles anymore, especially not the thick, unprocessed pieces Thomas insisted on using. Robert Chen, the most successful contractor in Asheville, had been particularly vocal. He stood 6'2", always wore expensive polo shirts with his company logo, and drove a brand new Ford F-250. Robert had built half the luxury homes in the area, and he made sure everyone knew it. That morning, Thomas had walked into Mountain Hardware to buy some nails. Robert was there with his crew, 5 younger men who hung on his every word like disciples. "Thomas, those shingles of yours are going to be a disaster," Robert announced loudly enough for everyone in the store to hear. "You're using full bark pieces. They're crude, uneven. You need to split them, man. That's how it's done properly." Thomas had simply nodded, paid for his nails, and left. He had learned long ago that arguing with men like Robert was pointless. His grandfather had taught him how to make bark shingles when he was just a boy in the Appalachian woods. The old way, the right way, but Robert was not finished. Over the following weeks, he drove by Thomas's property regularly, sometimes stopping to shake his head dramatically. Once, he brought a client to see what not to do when building a mountain home. Thomas watched from inside his cabin as Robert pointed at the roof, gesturing wildly, his client nodding along. The ridicule spread. At the local diner, waitresses who used to smile at Thomas now whispered when he walked in. The cashier at the grocery store asked if he was the guy building that weird cabin with tree bark. Even the mailman made a comment about hoping the roof would not fall on Thomas's head during the first storm. Thomas kept working. Every morning at sunrise, he climbed his ladder and continued laying his bark shingles, one careful piece at a time. He had developed his own technique over the months, something his grandfather had shown him but that he had refined through trial and error. Instead of splitting the bark thin like everyone else did, Thomas kept it thick and whole. He would soak each piece in water for exactly 48 hours, then lay it in a specific overlapping pattern that allowed for expansion and contraction. Eleanor would have understood. She always believed in him even when everyone else thought his ideas were crazy. She used to say that the old ways survived for a reason, that modern did not always mean better. Thomas wished she could see the cabin now, nearly complete, the bark shingles covering almost the entire roof in their natural rustic pattern. But doubt had begun creeping in. What if Robert was right? What if his shingles failed during the first heavy rain? What if he was just a stubborn old man clinging to outdated methods? Thomas lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling of his temporary trailer, wondering if he was building a monument to foolishness rather than love. The breaking point came on a Wednesday afternoon. Thomas was at the lumberyard when Robert arrived with 3 members of the County Building Inspection Board. They were touring various construction sites, and Robert had insisted they stop by to see Thomas's cabin. "Gentlemen, this is what happens when someone refuses to follow modern building codes and common sense," Robert declared, standing in Thomas's front yard without permission. "Those bark shingles are a fire hazard and a structural joke. They will curl, crack, and fail within a year." One of the inspectors, a younger man named David Martinez, frowned as he examined the roof through binoculars. "They do look unusual. Very thick. Not standard at all." Thomas felt something break inside him. Not anger, but a deep, profound exhaustion. Maybe it was time to give up. Maybe it was time to accept that Eleanor's dream would remain forever unfinished. The humiliation intensified over the next 2 weeks. Robert Chun made it his personal mission to ensure Thomas became the cautionary tale of Asheville's construction community. He posted photos of the cabin on the local builders forum with comments about outdated techniques and safety concerns. The post received 43 comments, most of them mocking. Thomas stopped going to town. He ordered supplies by phone and had them delivered. The isolation reminded him of those first months after Eleanor died, when the world felt too heavy to face. He would sit on his porch in the evenings, looking at the roof he had worked so hard on, wondering if he had wasted an entire year of his life. Then the official notice arrived. The county building department wanted to schedule an inspection. David Martinez would be coming personally to evaluate whether the structure met safety standards. The letter was polite but firm. There were concerns about the roofing materials and methodology. Thomas knew Robert was behind it. He had the connections, the influence. This was not about building codes. This was about being right, about proving that the old man in the mountains did not know what he was doing. The night before the inspection, Thomas could not sleep. He walked outside at 3 in the morning, flashlight in hand, and climbed the ladder to examine his shingles more closely. In the beam of light, they looked exactly as they should. Thick, solid, layered with precision. Each piece had been placed with care, following the pattern his grandfather had taught him 50 years ago. But doubt gnawed at him. The modern contractors all split their bark thin. There had to be a reason, right? Maybe his grandfather's method worked in the 1930s but was obsolete now. Maybe he was just a sentimental fool trying to honor a dead woman's dream with outdated techniques. Morning came too quickly. David Martinez arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, clipboard in hand, accompanied by Robert Chun. Thomas felt his stomach drop when he saw Robert step out of the county truck. Of course, he would be here to witness the final humiliation. "Mr. Whitmore," David began, his tone professional but not unkind. "We need to discuss some concerns about your roofing system. Several contractors have raised questions about structural integrity and fire safety." Robert stood behind David, arms crossed, a slight smirk on his face. "Those bark shingles are not up to code, Thomas. You are going to have to tear them down and start over. This time, do it right. Split cedar shakes, properly treated and installed." Thomas felt the words like physical blows. Tear it down. Start over. All those months of work. All those memories of Eleanor guiding his hands. Her voice in his head telling him to trust the old ways. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. David Martinez walked slowly around the cabin, examining the roof from every angle. He pulled out a moisture meter, a thermal camera, and made notes on his clipboard. Robert followed close behind, pointing out what he considered flaws, his voice loud and confident. "Look at the thickness, David. Those pieces are at least 3 times thicker than standard split shakes. They are going to trap moisture, rot from the inside, and in summer heat, they will curl and crack. It is basic physics." Thomas stood silently, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He thought about Eleanor, about the drawings they had made together, about her insistence that this cabin be built the way his grandfather would have built it. Traditional, authentic, real. David climbed the ladder himself, something that surprised both Thomas and Robert. He spent nearly 20 minutes on the roof, running his hands over the bark shingles, checking the overlaps, testing the flexibility. When he came down, his expression was unreadable. "Mr. Whitmore, can you explain your installation method?" David asked. Thomas hesitated, then found his voice. "I soak each piece for 2 days. The bark absorbs water, becomes pliable. I lay them thick and whole, overlapping by exactly 4 inches. The thickness creates natural insulation. The whole pieces do not split or separate. My grandfather built 3 houses this way in the 1930s. 2 are still standing." Robert laughed. "The 1930s? Come on, David. This is not historical preservation. This is a man refusing to accept modern improvements." David held up his hand, silencing Robert. He looked at Thomas with new interest. "Your grandfather, what was his name?" "James Whitmore." He learned from the Cherokee builders in these mountains. David's eyes widened slightly. James Whitmore from Marshall? The one who built the Patterson Lodge? Thomas nodded, surprised. You know it? Know it? David said, his voice changing completely. That lodge survived Hurricane Hugo in 1989 when half the structures in the area were destroyed. I wrote my thesis on traditional Appalachian building techniques. Your grandfather's work is legendary in preservation circles. Robert's smirk vanished. Wait, what? David turned to Robert, his professional demeanor now tinged with something else. Excitement. Respect. Robert, split shakes curl because they are thin and the wood fibers separate under heat stress. But full bark pieces, when properly prepared and installed, actually have superior performance. The thickness prevents warping. The natural oils in unsplit bark repel moisture better than any sealant. If you are torcenting for Thomas right now, take a moment and subscribe to the channel. This story is about to take a turn nobody saw coming, especially not Robert Chun. David looked back at Thomas. Mr. Whitmore, I need to ask you something important. Would you be willing to let me document this technique? And possibly, would you consider teaching it? Robert's face turned red. David, you cannot be serious. This is just bark nailed to a roof. There is nothing revolutionary here. David ignored him completely, his attention fixed on Thomas. Mr. Whitmore, there is going to be a heat wave next week. Weather Service is predicting temperatures above 95 degrees for 6 consecutive days. Would you allow me to bring thermal imaging equipment and compare your roof's performance against standard installations? Thomas felt something shift inside him. Not triumph, not vindication, but a quiet stirring of hope. Yes, he said simply. The heat wave arrived exactly as predicted. By the third day, Asheville was sweltering under temperatures that reached 98 degrees. David returned with 2 colleagues from the State Historic Preservation Office and equipment Thomas had never seen before. They set up thermal cameras aimed at Thomas's cabin and, with Robert's reluctant permission, at one of his recently completed luxury homes half a mile down the road. Robert had insisted on being present, certain that his split cedar shakes would prove superior. He brought his entire crew, turning it into a spectacle. Word spread through town. By the afternoon, nearly 20 people had gathered, contractors and curious locals alike. The results were undeniable. David's equipment showed that Robert's thin split shakes were curling visibly at the edges, separating from the roof deck as the wood fibers contracted under extreme heat. The thermal camera revealed surface temperatures exceeding 130 degrees. Thomas's thick bark shingles remained completely flat. The thermal readings showed surface temperatures 20 degrees cooler. The bark's natural thickness and oil content were acting as insulation, exactly as Thomas had intended. David projected the images on his laptop for everyone to see. The contrast was stark, irrefutable. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Robert stared at the screen, his jaw tight. This does not prove anything long-term. Wait until winter. Wait until the rain. But his voice lacked conviction. Several contractors were already approaching Thomas, asking questions about his technique, his grandfather's methods. One woman, Jennifer Kowalski, who owned a sustainable building company, was taking notes furiously. Thomas, I have clients who would pay premium prices for authentic traditional construction, Jennifer said. Would you consider consulting on projects? Over the following days, everything changed. The local newspaper ran a story, Mountain Man's Old World Technique Outperforms Modern Methods. The article included quotes from David about traditional Appalachian building wisdom and featured side-by-side photos of the 2 roofs under thermal imaging. Thomas's phone, which had been silent for months, started ringing. A documentary filmmaker wanted to interview him. A building materials company wanted to discuss manufacturing bark shingles using his preparation method. The community college asked if he would teach a weekend workshop on traditional techniques. Robert Chin stopped driving by. His trucks no longer appeared on the mountain road. Thomas heard through town gossip that several of Robert's clients had requested modifications to their contracts, wanting more traditional elements incorporated into their builds. 3 months later, Thomas stood in front of 24 students at the Blue Ridge Folk School. demonstrating how to properly harvest and prepare bark shingles. His hands moved with practiced confidence as he showed them the soaking process, the precise angle for laying each piece, the overlapping pattern that his grandfather had perfected decades ago. Jennifer Kowalski sat in the front row, along with two architects from Charlotte and several young builders eager to learn sustainable techniques. Even David Martinez attended, though he already knew the method. He wanted to support Thomas, to show that the building department valued preservation of traditional craftsmanship. The workshop had a waiting list of 40 people. Thomas had agreed to teach 4 sessions over the next year. He charged enough to honor the value of the knowledge, but not so much that young builders could not afford it. Eleanor would have approved. She always said knowledge should be shared, not hoarded. His cabin was now featured in 3 architectural magazines. A professor from NC State had brought a group of engineering students to study the thermal properties of the bark shingles. The data confirmed what Thomas had always known. Thick, properly prepared bark outperformed modern materials in both insulation and durability. But the most unexpected change came from Robert Chun himself. On a cold November morning, Thomas heard a truck pull up to his property. He looked out to see Robert's Ford F-250, but Robert sat in the cab for a long time before finally stepping out. Thomas met him on the porch, unsure what to expect. Robert looked different, smaller somehow. The arrogance had drained from his posture. "Mr. Whitmore, I owe you an apology. A real one." Thomas said nothing, just waited. "I was wrong," Robert continued, his voice quiet. "Wrong about your methods, wrong about how I treated you. I spent 30 years thinking newer was always better, and I humiliated you because your approach threatened everything I thought I knew." He paused, looking at the roof. "I have a client building a retreat center. High-end, sustainable focus. They want authentic Appalachian design. Would you be willing to consult? I will pay your rate, whatever it is." Thomas studied the man in front of him. This was not easy for Robert. Apologies never were for men who had spent their lives being right. "I will consult," Thomas said finally. "But I want something else too. Anything. Stop by the folk school next month. Sit in on my workshop. Not as my competitor, as my student." Robert's eyes widened. Then he nodded slowly. A genuine smile crossed his face, the first humble expression Thomas had ever seen from him. "I will be there." After Robert left, Thomas walked through his completed cabin. Every room held memories of Eleanor, of their plans, of her unwavering faith in him. The bark shingle roof above him was solid, quiet, perfect. She had been right all along. The old ways survived because they worked, because they were born from generations of wisdom, not corporate marketing. 2 years had passed since that scorching summer when thermal cameras proved what Thomas had known in his heart all along. He stood now on the porch of his cabin, watching the morning mist roll through the Blue Ridge Mountains, a cup of coffee warming his hands. The cabin had weathered 2 harsh winters and 2 blazing summers without a single shingle needing replacement. The bark had darkened to a rich, deep brown, blending seamlessly with the forest around it. Visitors often said the cabin looked like it had grown from the mountain itself, organic and timeless. Thomas had become something he never expected. A teacher, a consultant, a guardian of dying knowledge. His workshops at the folk school were booked solid for the next 18 months. He had trained over 200 builders in traditional techniques, and 17 cabins across North Carolina now wore bark shingle roofs prepared using his grandfather's method. Jennifer Kowalski had become a close friend and frequent collaborator. Her sustainable building company had tripled in size, partly due to the authentic traditional techniques Thomas had helped her incorporate. She stopped by once a week, sometimes with questions, sometimes just to sit on the porch and talk about projects. Robert Chen had kept his word. He attended that first workshop and returned for 3 more. Their relationship had transformed into something Thomas never anticipated. Mutual respect. Robert now included traditional elements in his luxury builds, and he credited Thomas publicly. Last month, he invited Thomas to speak at the Regional Contractors Association. The same men who had mocked him 2 years ago now listened intently, taking notes. But the most meaningful change was quieter, more personal. Thomas had started a small foundation in Eleanor's name, offering scholarships to young people who wanted to learn traditional Appalachian building techniques. 5 students had received funding so far, including a young Cherokee woman named Sarah Swimmer who wanted to reconnect with her ancestral building methods. David Martinez had helped make it happen, connecting Thomas with grants and preservation organizations. The State Historic Preservation Office now used Thomas's cabin as a teaching example, bringing groups of architects and builders to study the construction. On the mantel inside, next to a photo of Eleanor, sat a letter from the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They wanted to feature his work in their magazine and discuss a partnership to document and preserve traditional Appalachian building techniques before they disappeared completely. Thomas thought about his grandfather James, about the Cherokee builders who had taught him, about the chain of knowledge passed down through generations. That chain had nearly broken, but it held. And now it was growing stronger. He finished his coffee and walked inside. Today he would drive to Marshall to meet with Sarah and 2 other students. They were starting a cabin together, and Sarah wanted to learn not just bark shingles but also traditional stone foundation work. Eleanor's dream had become something bigger than either of them had imagined. Not just a cabin, but a living bridge between past and future.